Sarah Bennett pulled into the parking lot of the Jefferson County Courthouse at precisely 9:15 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning. The day was bright and clear, with the sun already high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city. Despite the fact that Sarah was one of the wealthiest people in Jefferson, with a multi-million-dollar real estate empire that spanned half of downtown, she didn't look the part. She was dressed casually in a simple pair of blue jeans, a plain white shirt and comfortable walking shoes, an outfit she frequently wore when conducting property inspections. Her clothes were chosen more for practicality than status. They were her uniform for work, a way of maintaining the down-to-earth persona that Sarah preferred to project. Sarah's morning had started like any other. She had woken up at 5 a.m. in her modest three-bedroom home on the outskirts of town. Despite her considerable wealth, Sarah had always preferred a simple, unassuming lifestyle. Her mother had taught her that true wealth wasn't about showing off or acquiring luxury goods, it was about making a meaningful impact in the community. Sarah took this lesson to heart and had built her success quietly behind the scenes, focusing more on making a difference than on flaunting her wealth. As Sarah made her way toward the courthouse steps, she couldn't help but smile at the irony of the situation. Just a week ago, her company had quietly purchased the Jefferson County Courthouse through a private holding corporation. It was part of Sarah's larger strategy to improve the city's infrastructure while ensuring that government offices and services remained affordable for local residents. Her latest acquisition had been a significant one, but it wasn't about prestige. It was about making the courthouse a symbol of positive change, a place where the community could rely on fair and efficient services. However, today she wasn't here to celebrate her real estate investments. Today she was dealing with a parking ticket. The $50 fine she had received 2 weeks ago was for a parking violation that occurred when one of the downtown parking meters malfunctioned. Sarah had tried to call the clerk's office to explain the situation and provide evidence that the meter was broken, but they insisted that she come to court to resolve the matter in person. With the photos of the faulty meter on her phone and all the necessary documentation in hand, she felt confident this would be a simple issue to resolve. As Sarah approached the courthouse, she passed a steady stream of people rushing up the steps, most of them wearing suits and carrying briefcases. A few of them nodded politely as they passed by, not recognizing her as the owner of numerous buildings in the area. Sarah didn't mind this anonymity. She had spent her career building a real estate empire quietly, letting her work speak for itself rather than broadcasting her success. At just 35 years old, she had already become a prominent figure in the city, but she preferred to stay out of the limelight. Her focus was always on improving the community, not on drawing attention to herself. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning hit her as she entered, sending a blast of cold air over her face as she made her way across the gleaming marble floors. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a clinical glow on the high ceilings, and the echo of footsteps reverberated through the expansive hallway. Sarah checked the notice once more, Courtroom 3B, Judge William Harrison presiding. She had plenty of time, so she made her way to the waiting area just outside the courtroom. The bench she sat on was hard, and as she waited, she observed the people around her. A young mother was struggling with a crying baby, an elderly man was nervously shuffling through some papers, and 2 teenagers whispered quietly in the corner, likely trying to figure out what their upcoming hearing would entail. Sarah pulled out her phone and reviewed the photos of the malfunctioning meter one more time. She felt a quiet sense of frustration at having to deal with such a trivial matter, especially when she had already provided the evidence that should have made the case a straightforward dismissal. She glanced at the clock on her phone, 10 a.m. It was time. The courtroom doors opened with a loud creak and the bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Harrison." His voice echoed throughout the courtroom as everyone stood in unison. Judge Harrison, a tall man with gray hair and a stern face, strode confidently to the bench, wearing the traditional black robes of his office. His reputation preceded him. He was known for being strict, traditional, and, as some whispered, not entirely impartial when it came to certain defendants. Sarah took her seat quietly and waited for her case to be called. She observed Harrison closely as he handled each case before hers. He was calm and collected with most defendants, though his demeanor shifted when he dealt with a Hispanic man who was struggling to explain his traffic violation in broken English. The judge's visible irritation was impossible to miss, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder how much of that judgment was influenced by the defendant's ethnicity. Finally, the clerk called out her name. Case number 247, Sarah Bennett, parking violation. Sarah stood and walked confidently to the podium, her documentation in hand. She noticed Judge Harrison's expression shift ever so slightly as he looked up from his papers and saw her. His eyes narrowed and his mouth tightened into a thin line. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice carrying a hint of condescension. "You're here for a parking violation on Oak Street dated October 15th, yes?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied politely. "I have evidence that the meter was malfunctioning that day. Several other people had the same issue." Judge Harrison raised a hand to stop her. "Miss Bennet, the citation clearly states that your meter expired at 2:15 p.m. Are you suggesting that our city's equipment is faulty?" Sarah tried again, offering the photos on her phone. "Your Honor, if you'll just look at these." "I've heard enough excuses today," Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone cold. His voice boomed across the courtroom, carrying a sense of finality that immediately put Sarah on edge. She could feel the tension rising in the room, and she knew from experience that Judge Harrison had already made up his mind. What he didn't know, however, was that this case would soon become the talk of Jefferson County. The quiet woman standing before him, in her simple clothes and unassuming demeanor, owned not just the courthouse building but also much of the land it stood on, along with several other key properties in the downtown area. Sarah Bennet wasn't just another defendant. She was someone with enough influence to change things. Someone who had spent years working to improve Jefferson, not just with her wealth, but with her vision for a better future. As she stood there, calm and composed, she recognized that this case, though seemingly trivial, would soon set in motion a chain of events that would not only alter Judge Harrison's career but also the entire Jefferson County justice system. She had dealt with people like him before. Those who made quick judgments based on appearances, who didn't take the time to understand the full picture before making a decision. And as frustrating as it was, Sarah knew that sometimes you had to let these moments play out in order to create real change. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, looking down at Sarah with cold eyes. The tension was palpable. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, but it seemed like everyone could feel the weight of the moment. "Miss Bennet," Judge Harrison's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Perhaps you don't understand how things work in my courtroom. We don't waste time with excuses about broken meters." He picked up her file and began flipping through it slowly, making a show of reviewing the documents as if he were searching for something to discredit her. Sarah remained calm, her heart beating faster with each passing moment. She had dealt with people like Judge Harrison before, people who didn't listen, who thought they knew everything and who were quick to judge. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Your Honor, I have photos that clearly show—" Silence. Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the courtroom, cutting her off sharply. Several people in the audience jumped in their seats at the outburst. Sarah noticed the stark contrast in the way Judge Harrison treated her compared to a few minutes earlier when he had allowed a young white man to explain his case for nearly 10 minutes. The difference was striking, and it wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Even the court reporter had stopped typing and was watching the exchange with concern. "Now then," Judge Harrison continued, "this is your third parking violation this year." He looked down at Sarah with disapproval, clearly expecting her to cower or offer another apology. "You've had enough chances." "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah said carefully, "those previous citations were dismissed because—" "Did I give you permission to speak?" Judge Harrison snapped. His face was turning slightly red with anger. He turned to his clerk, who was sitting nervously at her desk. "Show me Miss Bennet's record." The clerk, a young woman named Amy, hesitated for a moment. She had seen the dismissal records and knew they could clear Sarah's name, but she seemed afraid to contradict the judge. Finally, she spoke quietly. "Sir, the previous citations were dismissed." "Dismissed?" Judge Harrison's voice was rising. He looked at Sarah with incredulity, not realizing the depths of her influence, nor the way she was about to change the way justice was administered in Jefferson County. This was just the beginning. Judge Harrison sat behind his desk, feeling a sense of self-satisfaction after delivering what he considered a harsh but deserved punishment to Sarah Bennet. The courtroom had been filled with an electric tension when he had imposed the excessive $5,000 fine on her for a parking violation. The fine was far beyond the usual penalty for such a minor infraction, which typically carried only a $50 fee. But Harrison, in his usual overbearing way, had insisted that Bennett's alleged disregard for the city's parking laws was a demonstration of a broader disrespect for authority, an attitude that, in his mind, warranted an extraordinary penalty. He didn't mind the stunned silence in the courtroom or the shocked looks exchanged by others present. In his mind, he was teaching a lesson to the wealthy property owner who had the audacity to come into his courtroom with such a casual attitude. He had expected her to be ruffled, maybe even contrite, but she had held her ground, a woman who, despite her wealth, was dressed plainly and refused to be cowed by his authority. As Sarah left the courtroom, her head held high, she felt a simmering sense of injustice. The excessive fine was just one more example of the kind of treatment people like her, people who didn't fit into Harrison's rigid worldview, were subjected to in his courtroom. She wasn't just upset about the fine itself, she was angry on behalf of all the people who had ever been mistreated or ignored by this system. Sarah had spent years carefully building her empire, making sure to blend into the community and contribute in a meaningful way, and she wasn't going to let Harrison's petty abuse of power slide. The $5,000 fine he had imposed wasn't just unfair, it was a slap in the face to all those who had ever found themselves on the wrong side of his harsh, arbitrary judgments. Sarah walked down the courthouse hallway, clutching the notice in her hand. She knew that there was much more at stake now than just the fine itself. As she approached the courthouse cafeteria, she could hear the low hum of conversation, people talking about the morning's events, and Sarah realized the story of her case had already begun to spread. Inside the cafeteria, a mix of courthouse employees, lawyers, and visitors milled about, getting their morning coffee or grabbing a bite to eat. Sarah stood in line, overhearing bits and pieces of conversation as the news of Judge Harrison's over-the-top fine quickly became the topic of discussion. "Did you hear about that parking ticket case this morning?" a young lawyer whispered to his colleague. $5,000 for a parking violation? That's insane. Classic Harrison, the other lawyer replied, shaking his head. He's been getting worse lately. Someone needs to report him to the Judicial Review Board. Sarah paid for her coffee, her lips curling into a small smile at the irony of it all. The fine wasn't just ridiculous, it was going to backfire on Harrison in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. She had a meeting in an hour with County Commissioner James Thompson, a man who had been eager to discuss her plans to renovate and modernize the very building where Judge Harrison had just passed down his judgment. The plans were already in motion, and today's court appearance, though seemingly minor, would soon become the catalyst that exposed the cracks in Harrison's power. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and that lack of awareness was about to come back to haunt him. After finishing her coffee, Sarah moved toward the elevator where her assistant, Michael, was waiting with a thick folder of documents, blueprints and renovation plans for the courthouse. She glanced at her watch, noting that it was 11:30 a.m. Her meeting with Commissioner Thompson was scheduled for noon, but she had plenty of time to prepare. The timing, she thought, couldn't have been better. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Harrison was feeling smug, having dismissed Sarah's case as nothing more than an attempt to undermine his authority. He was just finishing his sandwich, relaxing in his chair, when a knock on his door interrupted his lunch. "Come in," he called out, his mouth still full of turkey and Swiss cheese. Emmy, the court clerk, entered cautiously. She looked nervous, and Harrison didn't miss the hesitation in her step. "What is it, Emmy?" he asked, irritated that his lunch was being disturbed. "I think there's something you should know about the Bennett case from this morning," she began. Harrison barely looked up from his sandwich. "What about it?" he asked dismissively, assuming it was nothing important. "I checked her record more thoroughly," Emmy said, her voice faltering. "Those previous tickets? They were all dismissed. The meter on Oak Street has been malfunctioning for months. The city's maintenance records confirm it." Harrison's eyes narrowed, but he wasn't particularly concerned. "It doesn't matter now," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "The fine's been set. She'll think twice before disrespecting my courtroom again." Emmy hesitated before speaking again. "Sir, there's something else," she said quietly. "I saw her name on some documents that came through the county clerk's office last week. She's the new owner of the courthouse building." Before Emmy could finish, Harrison's phone rang. It was the county commissioner's office, asking him to attend a meeting at 12:30 p.m. about the courthouse renovations. Harrison's expression turned even more sour. "Great," he muttered to himself. "Just what I need. Another meeting about this building?" As Sarah walked toward the elevators, she felt a sense of anticipation building within her. She had played her part today, and now it was time for the next phase of her plan. She had already made her mark, and now it was time to make the truth known to everyone. The $5,000 fine, while excessive and unjust, had triggered something that would soon come to light. Judge Harrison's arrogance had set the stage for the exposure of his misconduct, and Sarah was about to capitalize on the opportunity. She entered the commissioner's office at noon, where Commissioner James Thompson greeted her warmly. "Miss Bennett, I'm so glad you could make it. I've been looking forward to discussing your plans for the courthouse renovation." He gestured to a pair of comfortable chairs, and Sarah took a seat. She spread out the blueprints on the commissioner's desk, outlining the initial phase of the project. "We're planning to modernize the courthouse while preserving its historical character," Sarah explained. The first phase includes upgrading the courtrooms with better acoustics and new technology, which should make the judicial process more efficient. They were deep into the details of the project when another knock interrupted their conversation. The door opened and Judge Harrison stepped inside. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Sarah sitting there. His face went pale and for a moment he was speechless. "Ah, Judge Harrison," Commissioner Thompson said cheerfully, unaware of the tension in the room. "Perfect timing. I wanted you to meet Ms. Bennett properly. She's the new owner of the courthouse building. She's planning some wonderful improvements for the courtroom." Harrison's mouth hung open in shock as he froze in the doorway. He couldn't believe his eyes. Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm and professional. "Judge Harrison and I have already met," she said smoothly, her voice steady. "In fact, he just fined me $5,000 for a parking violation at a meter that maintenance records show has been broken for months." Commissioner Thompson's eyebrows shot up in surprise. $5,000 for a parking ticket? Sarah nodded. "Yes." It was quite an interesting experience seeing how justice is administered in this courthouse. She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm sure the commissioner will agree that there are some improvements that need to be made, not just to the building but to how justice is administered here." Judge Harrison's face turned a deep shade of red as the full weight of the situation began to sink in. Sarah's casual mention of the parking ticket had shattered the illusion he had carefully crafted of being an unassailable authority figure. In that moment, Harrison realized that he was no longer in control. The truth about the courthouse, and about Sarah's ownership, was about to come out, and it was clear that this would be a turning point for the entire judicial system in Jefferson County. The power dynamic had shifted, and Harrison had no idea what was coming next. But Sarah Bennett did. She had been patient, allowing the situation to unfold in its own time. Now, with the truth in full view, she was poised to make real, lasting changes. The color drained from Judge Harrison's face as the weight of Sarah Bennett's words sank in. The woman he had dismissed so arrogantly just hours before, the one he had fined an excessive $5,000 for a simple parking violation, was not just any citizen, she was his new landlord. The realization hit him like a freight train, and for the first time he felt a sinking feeling in his chest that he couldn't ignore. His bravado, his authority, all the power he had assumed he wielded in that courtroom, gone. He had just fined the very woman who now owned the building he had worked in for years. "I believe," Sarah added, her tone calm but unwavering, "Courtroom 3B will be the first to receive renovations. We'll need to temporarily relocate the proceedings during construction, of course." She turned back to the blueprints laid out before her, as if discussing nothing more than an ordinary business transaction. Judge Harrison stood frozen in the doorway, his hands at his sides, unable to move. The moment had turned from one of self-assured authority to sheer disbelief. The events of the morning that had seemed so normal, so typical for him, had suddenly spiraled into something he couldn't quite grasp. His mind was racing. He had tried to exert control over Sarah Bennett with that $5,000 fine, but now he could only wonder how much bigger the consequences would be. He hadn't anticipated this, he hadn't seen it coming. The fine, the small victory he thought he'd won, had now become the beginning of a much bigger issue. A sinking feeling overtook him. This was just the start of his troubles. As Sarah continued discussing the courthouse renovations, Harrison's mind was elsewhere, lost in the realization of his predicament. News of the situation spread through the Jefferson County Courthouse like wildfire. By the time the clock hit 2 p.m., everyone, from the janitors to the senior judges, had heard about what had transpired in Commissioner Thompson's office. The story grew with each retelling, with each person adding a new detail. The most shocking revelation, of course, was that Sarah Bennett wasn't just any wealthy property owner, she was the new owner of the very building where Harrison held his court. The narrative took on a life of its own, becoming a tale of a judge who had unfairly punished the person who had the power to change everything. Judge Harrison, sitting in his chambers, tried to process the day's events. He poured his third cup of coffee, his hands shaking as the memories replayed over and over in his mind. He had been so quick to judge Sarah, so sure of his control and authority, but now everything felt as if it was falling apart. He hadn't known who she was when he passed judgment on her, but that ignorance was now his biggest mistake. If only he had known. But there was no turning back now. The court of public opinion was already moving against him, and his phone kept ringing with reporters demanding comments. Another knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He jumped, startled. "Come in," he called out, hoping for some distraction, something that could take his mind off the mess he had created. It was Chief Judge Martinez, his supervisor, and he didn't look happy. "Bill, we need to talk," Martinez said, closing the door behind him with an air of finality. "I've received 3 calls in the last hour about what happened this morning. The local news is already asking for comments." Harrison slumped back in his chair, feeling the weight of the conversation. "I didn't know who she was," he said weakly, trying to explain away his actions. Martinez didn't even flinch. "That's exactly the problem," he replied sharply. "You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. $5,000 for a parking ticket? What were you thinking?" His voice carried a note of both disappointment and disbelief, and Harrison could feel his career unraveling before his very eyes. Meanwhile, Sarah was sitting in her downtown office, carefully reviewing the flood of emails pouring in. Local civil rights organizations were reaching out, wanting to meet with her to discuss the case. Others who had faced similar mistreatment in Judge Harrison's courtroom were contacting her, eager to share their stories of unfair rulings and prejudiced treatment. Her assistant, Michael, knocked and entered with a stack of papers, interrupting her thoughts. "Miss Bennett, the courthouse maintenance records you requested are here," Michael said, placing a folder on her desk. "They confirm that the meter on Oak Street has been reported broken 8 times in the past 3 months. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the documents. Then Michael slid a small USB drive across the table. "And here's the video footage. The security cameras caught everything in the courtroom." The court reporter also sent over the official transcript from the hearing. Sarah gave a small nod of appreciation. The evidence was piling up. She was building her case, but this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, in the courthouse, Amy, the court clerk, was hard at work. She had been quietly collecting data for months, documenting patterns in Judge Harrison's rulings. She had noticed something disturbing, a consistent discrepancy in how different defendants were treated based on race, appearance, and other biases. Now she was pulling files from the past year, compiling the evidence Sarah needed to take down Harrison. Amy had been concerned about what she had witnessed in the courtroom, but now it seemed like there was a chance that someone might actually listen to her. Back in Harrison's chambers, his secretary knocked again, this time with the news that a reporter from the Jefferson Daily News Online was calling. "They're running a story about what happened this morning," she informed him. "Tell them no comment," Harrison snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he regretted them. He could feel himself unraveling, and it was taking a toll. The stress of the situation had drained him of his usual confidence, and he was beginning to realize just how frequently he had dismissed people over the years with a curt word or a dismissive tone. By 3:30 p.m., Sarah had another meeting scheduled, this time with her lawyers. They gathered in her conference room to review the events of the morning. Her lead attorney, Jennifer Martinez, began speaking first. "The fine was clearly excessive," she said, opening a folder and reviewing the documents in front of her. "But more importantly, we found a pattern of similar behavior in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The data shows significant disparities in how he treats different defendants based on race and appearance." Sarah looked out the window of her office, her eyes drifting to the courthouse building across the street. This wasn't about revenge, she told herself. This was about making sure this kind of injustice didn't happen to anyone else. She had the power, the resources, and now the momentum to push for real change. Back in Harrison's chambers, the door opened again. This time it was his old friend and fellow judge, Robert Chin. He sat down heavily across from Harrison, his face serious. "Bill," Chin said, looking at him with a mixture of concern and disappointment. "I've been your friend for 20 years, but I need to be honest with you. What happened today? It's not an isolated incident. We've all seen how you treat certain defendants differently." Judge Harrison started to protest, but Judge Chin held up his hand, cutting him off. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "This is your wake-up call. You can either learn from it, or it can be the end of your career." The weight of his friend's words was unmistakable, and Harrison couldn't help but feel the gravity of the situation. He was cornered, facing a reckoning that could end his career if he didn't make real changes. Later that afternoon, Sarah received a call from Commissioner Thompson. "Miss Bennett," he began, "the Judicial Review Board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're requesting your presence." "I'll be there," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "And Commissioner, please make sure Judge Harrison knows that my plans for renovating his courtroom haven't changed." For Sarah, the next day was just another step in her quiet mission to improve the community she had invested so much in. But for Judge Harrison, it was the beginning of a painful and necessary lesson about justice, prejudice, and the consequences of judging a book by its cover. The real changes were only just beginning, and tomorrow would bring even more surprises for everyone involved. The following morning, the Jefferson County Judicial Review Board convened in their conference room on the top floor of the courthouse. 7 members sat around a large oak table with Chairman David Roberts at the head. The room was tense as they waited for Sarah Bennett to arrive. At exactly 9 a.m., Sarah walked in, dressed in a navy blue suit, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. This time, there was no mistaking her position of authority. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bennett," Chairman Roberts said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We've called this emergency meeting to address yesterday's incident and some broader concerns that have come to light." Just then Amy, the court clerk, entered with a cart full of files. "These are all the cases from Judge Harrison's courtroom over the past year," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been keeping track of the patterns." The board members exchanged uneasy glances as Amy began unloading the files. Sarah's lawyer, Jennifer Martinez, stood up and began distributing reports she had prepared. "What you're receiving," Jennifer explained, "is a statistical analysis of Judge Harrison's rulings over the past 12 months. The data clearly shows patterns of bias in his sentencing." Man Roberts put on his reading glasses and began reviewing the first page. His frown deepened as he read. "According to these numbers," he said, his voice low, "Judge Harrison gives fines averaging 200% higher to minorities compared to white defendants for the same violations." Down in his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone, his thoughts consumed by the weight of what was unfolding. His phone rang constantly, but he ignored the calls. He had been so sure of himself just the day before, but now he realized how little control he had over the outcome of this situation. The phone calls and the reports, he couldn't escape them. The consequences were coming, and it was becoming clear that nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah's voice was calm and measured as she addressed the board. The morning's incident, where she had been unfairly fined for a parking violation, wasn't just about her, she explained, it was about every person who had walked into Judge Harrison's courtroom and faced unjust treatment. As she spoke, the board members listened intently, their expressions varying between concern and disbelief. Sarah had come prepared. She wasn't there just to air grievances, she was there to show the board the extent of the problem and to propose a solution. Sarah's lawyer, Jennifer Martinez, stood beside her, ready to assist. Sarah began by playing the security footage from the previous day's hearing, a key piece of evidence. The footage showed Judge Harrison's dismissive behavior, his interruptions, and the excessive fine he had imposed on her for a minor infraction. But that was just the beginning. As the board members watched, they saw more footage, this time from other cases, showing the stark contrast in how Judge Harrison treated defendants. In one case, the judge had been short and condescending with a young black woman, giving her a fine far beyond what was reasonable. In another, he had treated a white businessman with patience, offering him a chance to explain himself in great detail before delivering a much lighter sentence. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances as the evidence unfolded. "This is disturbing," board member Janet Chin said, shaking her head. "But what's even more concerning is that it went unchecked for so long." Amy, the court clerk who had been collecting data on Judge Harrison's rulings for months, stepped forward again, speaking in a quiet voice. "Many of us noticed, but we were afraid to speak up. Judge Harrison has a lot of influence here," she said, her voice tinged with the weariness of someone who had silently witnessed years of injustice. Sarah nodded. "I understand," she said. "That's why I'm here, to make sure that no one has to be afraid to speak up again." At that moment, Commissioner Thompson arrived, bringing additional evidence. He handed out a set of records that had just been reviewed, maintenance reports for the faulty parking meter. "It was reported broken multiple times," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen the failure to act. Judge Harrison had access to this information, but he chose to ignore it. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew that the day's meeting was already a turning point, but she wasn't finished. She stood up, walked to the window of the conference room, and looked out over the city below, gathering her thoughts. "I'm not here to demand Judge Harrison's removal," she said, surprising everyone in the room. The board members exchanged glances, unsure of what she was about to say next. "I'm here to propose a solution." Sarah turned back to face the board, her expression one of quiet determination. "As the new owner of this building, I have plans for renovations, but maybe we need to renovate more than just the physical structure. Maybe we need to change how justice is administered here," she said. Her words hung in the air, a call to action for a system that had allowed bias to fester unchecked for years. Chairman Roberts leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Bennett?" he asked, his voice both skeptical and intrigued. Sarah didn't hesitate. I'm proposing a complete overhaul of the system, she said firmly. Mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular review of sentencing patterns, and the establishment of a new community oversight committee to ensure accountability. She paused for a moment, then added, I'm willing to fund these programs myself. The room went quiet as the board members considered her words. They were taken aback by her commitment and the clear direction she was proposing. It was bold, but it was also something that many had feared might never come to fruition. A way to address the deep-rooted issues of bias in the courthouse, a way to create real change. Finally, board member Michael Wong spoke up, his voice thoughtful but practical. We should also review all of Judge Harrison's recent cases, he said. Some people might be entitled to refunds, or their cases might deserve appeals. Sarah nodded, grateful for his support. I agree, she said. And I want to be part of that process. I want to ensure that justice is done. The board members exchanged glances, the weight of the decisions they had to make settling in. They were beginning to see that what had started as a personal grievance had grown into a wider call for systemic change, a shift that could affect the entire courthouse. The room was quiet for a moment as they weighed their options. By noon, the board had reached several important decisions. Judge Harrison would be temporarily suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct, and all of his recent cases would be reviewed. But perhaps the most important decision was the approval of Sarah's proposed reforms. The board agreed to implement her ideas for mandatory training, regular reviews, and the establishment of an oversight committee. The change was not just a personal victory for Sarah, it was a victory for everyone who had been affected by the deep-seated biases in the system. As Sarah left the meeting, she passed Judge Harrison's empty courtroom. Through the window, she could see his vacant judge's chair, the symbol of his former authority. It was a stark reminder of how quickly things could change. For Sarah, it was another step in her mission to reform a broken system. For Judge Harrison, it was the beginning of a painful reckoning. Back at his home, Judge William Harrison sat alone in his study, staring at the suspension letter from the Judicial Review Board. The morning newspaper lay on his desk, its headline screaming, "Local judge under investigation, years of biased rulings exposed." His phone had been ringing non-stop for the past 2 days, but he hadn't answered a single call. He didn't know what to say. The situation had spiraled out of his control, and he felt trapped, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. His wife, Linda, knocked gently on the study door before entering with a cup of coffee. "Bill," she said softly, concern in her voice. "You need to eat something. You've been sitting here since yesterday." He looked up at his wife of 30 years, seeing the worry in her eyes. "How did I not see it, Linda?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years I thought I was being fair. How could I have been so blind?" Linda sat down across from him, her gaze gentle but firm. "Remember what your father used to say about Judge Matthews back in the 60s? How he treated your Irish immigrant grandparents in his courtroom?" The memory hit Harrison hard. His grandfather had lost his small business because of Judge Matthews' unfair ruling, and his family had suffered for it. Harrison had promised himself that he would never be that kind of judge, that he would never be the person who treated others unjustly. But now, years later, he found himself doing the same thing. His heart sank as the weight of his actions came crashing down on him. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Amy, the court clerk, was working late, helping the review team go through Judge Harrison's old cases. Each file she looked at told a story of subtle bias: higher fines for minorities, stricter sentences, less patience during hearings. She looked at one particular case and turned to Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer. "Look at this one," Amy said, pointing to a file. "A young black man got 6 months for the same offense that a white college student got community service for just last month." Jennifer took the file from Amy, rubbing her tired eyes. "Over 200 cases, and the pattern is clear," she said. "Almost every case shows the same bias." That night, Sarah Bennett walked into the room carrying takeout dinner for the team. "How many cases have we reviewed so far?" she asked. "Over 200, Jennifer replied, her voice exhausted but resolute. "The pattern is clear." Meanwhile, back at his home, Judge Harrison had decided to watch the security footage from his courtroom that had been provided by the board. For 6 hours straight, he watched himself in case after case. He saw his expressions, his tone, his body language. He watched the way he treated defendants differently based on their appearance and race. In one video, he watched himself interrupt a Hispanic mother who was trying to explain her situation, while in the next case, he listened patiently to a white businessman for nearly 20 minutes, offering him every opportunity to speak. The contrast was painful to watch, and for the first time, Harrison understood just how far he had fallen from the ideal of fairness he had once held dear. Late that evening, Judge Harrison's daughter Rachel, a law student, came to visit. She found him still in his study, surrounded by the case files he had brought home. "Dad," she said, sitting next to him, "my professor used one of your cases as an example in class today. Not in a good way." Harrison looked at his daughter, seeing the disappointment in her eyes. "I bet you don't have an answer for me," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. Rachel looked at him, her expression soft but determined. "You can still make it right," she replied. "But first you have to truly understand what you did wrong." The next day, Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the proposed changes for the courthouse. The blueprints for the physical renovations now included plans for a new community justice center, where judges would receive regular training on bias and fair treatment. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Linda Harrison, the judge's wife. "Miss Bennett," the message read, "my husband would like to meet with you. Not to make excuses but to listen and learn. Would you be willing to give him that chance?" Sarah stared at the message for a long time, considering it. This wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was about creating real change. Sometimes that meant giving people a chance to learn from their mistakes. She typed her reply, "Tomorrow morning 9 a.m. at my office. Tell him to bring the notes he's surely been making while reviewing his cases." That night, both Sarah and Judge Harrison lay awake in their respective homes, thinking about the meeting ahead. For Sarah, it was another step toward her goal of improving the justice system. For Judge Harrison, it was a chance to begin making amends for years of unconscious bias. The next day would bring either the beginning of real change or the final end of his career. Everything depended on what he had learned from his time of reflection, and whether he was truly ready to change. The transformation of Jefferson County's justice system was about to enter its next phase. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge William Harrison stood outside Sarah Bennett's office building, his hands shaking as he clutched a thick notebook filled with his observations from reviewing his past cases. He had barely slept the night before, spending most of it writing down every instance of bias he had discovered in his rulings. The weight of his own realizations felt almost unbearable, but he knew that facing it head-on was the only way forward. As he approached the entrance, the security guard at the front desk looked up and recognized him immediately. "Miss Bennett is expecting you, Judge Harrison," the guard said, his voice neutral but polite. 15th floor. The elevator ride felt longer than usual as the doors slowly closed and the car began its ascent. Judge Harrison felt a tightness in his chest, his thoughts racing. How would Sarah Bennett, the woman who had once been so harshly treated by him, respond to his attempt at reconciliation? Would she see his efforts as genuine? Or would his past mistakes be too much to overcome? When the elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, Sarah's assistant Michael was waiting for him. "Please follow me, Judge Harrison. Miss Bennett is ready to see you," he said. The walk through the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet building. Sarah's office was just ahead, and as they reached the door, Michael gave a courteous knock before opening it. Inside, Sarah was standing by the large windows that overlooked the courthouse, a place Judge Harrison had spent the last 20 years of his life. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Judge Harrison said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it before. He wasn't the same man who had handed down countless decisions from his bench with arrogance and authority. Now he stood in front of Sarah, humbled, holding his thick notebook tightly in his hands. "I know I don't deserve your time." Sarah studied him carefully. The man before her was nothing like the confident, often dismissive judge she had encountered just days earlier. The weight of his own realizations was evident in the slump of his shoulders and the exhaustion on his face. His eyes looked like he hadn't slept in days. Sarah could see that he had truly reflected on his actions. "I didn't agree to this meeting to hear apologies," Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I want to hear what you've learned from reviewing your cases." Judge Harrison nodded, his hands trembling as he opened the thick notebook. I spent the last 3 days watching videos from my courtroom and reading through my old cases," he began. "The patterns are clear now. I was harder on minorities, quicker to interrupt them, less likely to believe their explanations. I treated people unfairly and I see that now." Sarah didn't interrupt him as he went through specific cases he had reviewed. He listed names, dates, and the details of how his bias had affected his decisions. His voice cracked as he spoke about the specific individuals who had been harmed by his actions. "There was Maria Rodriguez," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She tried to explain that she was late to court because her child was in the hospital. I fined her $500 for contempt. The very next day, I accepted a similar excuse from a white defendant without question. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he paused to compose himself. And James Washington, a young black man who got 6 months for a minor offense that I would have usually given community service for? Sarah listened intently, her expression thoughtful. She had reviewed these cases too, and hearing Judge Harrison speak so openly about them gave her a sense of cautious hope. She reached into her own folder and slid it across the desk to him. "What do you think should be done about them?" she asked. Judge Harrison didn't hesitate. "They all deserve new hearings," he said firmly. "I've written personal letters to each person I treated unfairly, admitting my bias and apologizing. They're all in this folder." He placed another thick envelope on the desk, and Sarah was genuinely surprised. She hadn't expected him to take such initiative. But even though his actions were a step in the right direction, it wasn't enough. "That's a good start, Judge Harrison," Sarah said, her tone acknowledging his efforts. "But what about the future? What happens when you return to the bench?" Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. He seemed to stand a little taller, more confident in his commitment to change. "If I'm allowed to return," he said, his voice steady, "I want to implement a system where all my rulings are reviewed monthly for bias. I want to work with community leaders to understand their perspectives and ensure that their voices are heard in my decisions." He paused, taking a deep breath before adding, "I want to mentor young judges to help them avoid making the same mistakes I did." Sarah stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the courthouse below. Her thoughts were a mixture of resolve and reflection. The courthouse was a place that had both shaped and been shaped by the flawed justice system. "Judge Harrison," she said, turning back to face him, "when I bought that building, I didn't just buy property. I bought an opportunity to create change. Your situation has given us a chance to transform the entire system." She walked back to her desk, where she picked up a file and placed it in front of him. "I'm willing to support your return to the bench under certain conditions," she said. "You'll work with our new Community Oversight Committee. You'll participate in regular bias training, and most importantly, you'll help us implement these changes across the entire courthouse." Judge Harrison nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Sarah's eyes were firm, but there was a slight softness in her voice. "Good. Because this isn't just about you anymore," she said. "It's about creating a justice system that truly serves everyone equally." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "We've started something important here. Let's make sure we finish it." As Judge Harrison left Sarah's office that morning, he felt both humbled and hopeful. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance to redeem himself, not just to save his career but to help create real, lasting change in a system he had once failed. He was determined to do everything in his power to make that happen. The transformation had begun, both within himself and within the Jefferson County justice system. 3 months later, the courthouse was a different place. The building itself was undergoing renovations, but the most significant changes weren't in the walls. They were in the people. The changes in the courthouse culture were visible to anyone who walked through its doors. The tension, the sense of distrust, had begun to melt away. On this particular morning, Judge Harrison stood before a packed courtroom, but he wasn't sitting on the bench. He was standing at the front of the room, addressing a group of judges, lawyers, and court staff about the importance of recognizing unconscious bias. "Last year," he said, addressing the attentive audience, "I would have denied having any prejudice. But I've learned that bias can creep into our decisions without us even knowing it. Let me show you exactly how that happens." In the back of the room, Sarah watched with satisfaction. The man speaking was nothing like the arrogant judge who had fined her 3 months ago. His hair was more gray now, but his eyes showed a depth of wisdom that hadn't been there before. He was no longer just the judge handing down verdicts. He was an active participant in shaping a better system. Emmy, the court clerk, raised her hand from the back of the room. "Judge Harrison, what's the biggest change you've noticed in yourself since the training began?" she asked. Harrison smiled thoughtfully. "I listen more," he said, his voice reflective. "I really listen. Yesterday, a young man came in for a traffic violation. In the past, I would have rushed through his explanation and made a quick decision. But this time, I learned that he was driving his sick mother to chemotherapy. That context mattered." Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, the new Community Oversight Committee was meeting. This committee, created by Sarah and composed of people from all parts of the community, teachers, social workers, former defendants, and civil rights activists, was reviewing the results of the changes that had been implemented. "The numbers are encouraging," Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer, reported to the committee. "In the past 3 months, We've reviewed over 500 old cases. More than 200 people have received refunds for excessive fines, and 50 cases have been reopened for new hearings. Back in the training session, Judge Harrison was showing video clips from his old courtroom sessions. He compared them with recent sessions to highlight the difference in his approach. The contrast was striking. "Watch how I interrupted this woman 6 times in 2 minutes, he said, pointing to an old video. Now watch a similar case from last week. This defendant speaks freely, and justice is better served because of it." During the lunch break, Sarah met with Commissioner Thompson in the new Courthouse Cafe, another of her improvements to the building. "The changes you and Judge Harrison have made are spreading," Thompson said excitedly. 3 other courthouses in the state have asked about implementing similar training programs. Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "That's good news," she said. "But we still have a long way to go." The transformation had started in Jefferson County, but it was only the beginning. There was much more work to be done. Next week, the Jefferson County Courthouse was set to launch its latest and perhaps most ambitious initiative, the Youth Justice Program. This program would bring high school students into the courthouse to observe the legal system in action and participate in mock trials, offering them a hands-on experience that many had never encountered before. Sarah Bennett, the owner of the courthouse and the driving force behind much of the reform, had been working tirelessly to put this plan into action. The program was a part of her broader vision for the future. A future where young people were not just passive observers of the system but active participants in learning how it worked, how it could fail, and how they could be part of the solution moving forward. In preparation for the Youth Justice Program, Judge William Harrison, who had become a central figure in the courthouse's reform, had volunteered to take the lead. His transformation from the arrogant, biased judge he had once been into the humble, thoughtful educator he had become was a testament to the power of change. The shift in his attitude had come after a series of soul-searching revelations, triggered by his own recognition of the biases he had displayed in his previous rulings. Judge Harrison knew that leading the youth program was an important step in his own redemption, but he also recognized the broader impact it could have on the community. Later that afternoon, as Sarah was walking through the courthouse, a familiar face appeared in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Maria Rodriguez, the woman who had been unfairly fined by Judge Harrison months ago, was back. But this time, she wasn't there to face the consequences of a wrongful judgment. Instead, Maria had been invited to join the Community Oversight Committee, a group that had been created as part of the courthouse's new commitment to transparency, accountability, and community involvement. The committee was designed to include people from all walks of life, ensuring that the perspectives of those who had been historically marginalized were represented and heard. Judge Harrison smiled warmly as Maria entered the courtroom. "Welcome, Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, stepping down from the bench to greet her. "Your perspective will be invaluable to our committee." Maria looked surprised at his friendly, respectful manner, clearly not used to seeing this side of him. "Thank you, Judge Harrison," she replied, though she still seemed a little uncertain. "My English is still not perfect, but—" Judge Harrison quickly reassured her. "Your English is just fine," he said with a warm smile. "And we now have court translators available whenever needed. That's one of the many changes Miss Bennett helped us implement." Maria nodded, her eyes showing appreciation for the new resources and openness. This was a different courthouse from the one she had encountered just months earlier, and she could feel the difference. As the day wore on, Sarah continued her tour of the courthouse, observing the many changes that had been put in place since she had taken ownership. The physical renovations were immediately noticeable, the walls had been freshly painted, and the overall atmosphere was lighter, more welcoming. But the true transformation was in the people. The courthouse had become a place where all members of the community felt comfortable and respected. People from all backgrounds, ethnicities, and walks of life now walked its halls, feeling heard, acknowledged, and valued. Sarah passed by Judge Harrison's courtroom one last time that evening. Through the open door, she saw him sitting at his desk, reviewing cases with a young law student intern. As Sarah paused to watch, she heard Judge Harrison's voice clearly from inside. "Justice isn't just about following the law," he was saying, "it's about seeing the human being in front of you." Sarah smiled to herself, proud of how far he had come. The arrogant judge who had once handed down harsh rulings without considering the full context of the people before him was now a mentor, an educator, and a reformer. Sarah continued her walk through the building, passing by the newly established spaces where local artists' work was displayed, artwork that highlighted themes of justice, community, and equality. The courthouse had become more than just a place where cases were heard and rulings were made. It had evolved into a space that celebrated the people it served and honored their stories. The courthouse now reflected the values that Sarah, Judge Harrison, and the entire team had worked so hard to instill: fairness, transparency, inclusivity, and respect for all individuals. Later that evening, Sarah found herself standing alone in her office for a moment of reflection. The framed parking ticket that had started it all hung on the wall behind her desk. That small, seemingly insignificant ticket had been the catalyst for an incredible transformation in Jefferson County's justice system. Sometimes, she thought, the most important changes begin with the smallest moments. The ticket, once a symbol of an unjust encounter, had now become a powerful reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they could go. The next day, the courthouse hosted a public forum, another new initiative designed to foster open dialogue between the community and the courthouse. The forum was part of the courthouse's commitment to transparency and accountability. People were invited to share their experiences, ask questions, and engage directly with the judges, staff, and administrators. As Sarah walked through the building that morning, she saw groups of community members entering for the event. The sense of openness and engagement was palpable, and Sarah felt a deep sense of pride. When the forum began, it became clear that the courthouse had undergone more than just physical changes. It had become a place where people felt heard, seen, and valued. A young man shared his experience with the new rehabilitation program, expressing gratitude for the second chance it had given him. A grandmother spoke about how the newly implemented translation services had made it easier for her and her family to navigate the legal system. Stories like these, Sarah knew, were the true measure of the courthouse's success. The celebration continued into the evening with a community dinner held in the courthouse plaza. People from all backgrounds sat together, breaking bread and sharing stories. Judge Harrison sat with Maria Rodriguez's family, learning Spanish from her children. The courthouse had become a place where people were not only getting justice, but also building relationships, sharing experiences, and growing together as a community. Sarah observed it all from a quiet corner, content in the knowledge that the transformation was far from over. It was only just beginning. 1 year had passed since Sarah first entered the courthouse, holding that parking ticket in her hands. Now, the Jefferson County Courthouse was celebrating its first anniversary of the Justice Reform Program. The main hall was filled with people from all walks of life: judges, lawyers, community members, and visitors from other states who had come to learn from Jefferson County's success. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd with a sense of accomplishment and gratitude. "A year ago," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong, "I walked into this courthouse as just another person with a parking ticket. Today we stand here celebrating something much bigger than any one person or incident. The walls of this courthouse tell their own story, new signs in multiple languages welcome visitors, and the halls are filled with artwork from local artists that reflect our values of justice and community." She paused for a moment, taking in the energy in the room. "We've created something truly special here." Judge Harrison stood up next to speak, his presence commanding attention. The man who had once been arrogant and closed off now spoke with humility and wisdom. "Last year, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," he said, his voice steady and honest. "Instead, thanks to Miss Bennett's vision and guidance, it became an opportunity to create real change. We've helped other people learn from my mistakes." He gestured to the board behind him, which displayed the year's achievements. 1,000 cases reviewed and corrected, 300 judges and court staff trained in bias awareness, 50 community programs launched, 5 other courthouses adopting the reform model, and 0 complaints of racial bias in the past 6 months. Maria Rodriguez stepped up to share her story next. "A year ago, I was afraid to come to this courthouse," she said, her English much improved. "Now, I help other people feel welcome here. This is what real justice looks like." Amy, who had been promoted to Chief Court Administrator, presented the next phase of the programs. "Next month," she announced, "we'll be opening the Youth Justice Academy. High school students will learn about law and justice from Judge Harrison and other reformed judges." The room erupted into applause. The ceremony continued with more speeches, including one from Rachel Harrison, Judge Harrison's daughter, who had recently graduated from law school. Rachel spoke about the legal clinic she was opening at the courthouse to provide free legal help to those who couldn't afford it. "My father's experience taught our whole family about the importance of fair justice," she said. "Now, I want to help make sure everyone has access to it." As the ceremony came to a close, a surprise visitor arrived, the mayor of Jefferson City. He carried an official proclamation declaring the day to be Justice Reform Day in the city. "What happened in this courthouse over the past year proves that change is possible," the mayor announced. One parking ticket led to a complete transformation of our justice system. Judge Harrison walked over to Sarah, holding something in his hands. It was a framed copy of the original $5,000 fine he had given her. "I keep this in my chambers," he said quietly. "It reminds me every day to look past my assumptions and see the real person standing before me." Sarah smiled and pulled out her own copy of the same ticket, which she had framed and hung in her office. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best lessons come from unexpected places." As the celebration continued, people shared stories of how the courthouse had changed their lives. The parking ticket that had started it all was now just a distant memory, but its impact would continue for generations to come. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become more than just a building. It had become a symbol of how true justice, when blind to color and status, could transform an entire community. And for Sarah Bennett, Judge Harrison, and everyone involved, this was just the beginning of their ongoing journey toward true justice for all.